I can hire 50 like you!
The Duke said, "Do it!"
The marble halls of the Rothschild estate echoed with his booming voice. "I can hire 50 like you," the Duke sneered, tossing her meticulous ledgers onto the mahogany desk. Genevieve didn't flinch. She calmly picked up her coat. "Do it," she replied, and walked away. But Nolan wasn't done. London, 1000, Lap 100 de Lap and Cymballin. The air in Mayfair was thick with the scent of coal smoke and impending rain, but inside the sprawling library of Grosvenor House, the atmosphere was suffocating for an entirely different reason. Nolan Montgomery, the Duke of Rothschild, stood by the towering arched windows, his broad shoulders rigid beneath a perfectly tailored charcoal morning coat. He was a man accustomed to absolute deference. His family had weathered centuries of political upheaval, outlasted monarchs, and built a fortune on shipping and Welsh coal. Yet, here he was, being dressed down in his own ancestral home by a woman who did not even possess a title. Genevieve Hastings sat across the room, her posture impeccably straight, her hands folded neatly over a leather-bound ledger. She had been sent by the prestigious Baring Brothers Bank. In an era when women were expected to concern themselves with needlepoint and high tea, Genevieve was a mathematical savant. Her father, a former chief actuary for the East India Company, had taught her to read the language of numbers before she could properly spell her own name. She saw the world not in emotions but in debits, credits, and undeniable truths. Baring Brothers kept her existence a closely guarded secret, utilizing her genius only for their most elite, financially imperiled clients. The Duke of Rothschild was bleeding money, and he had no idea why. "You are overstepping your boundaries, Miss Hastings," Nolan said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned to face her, his sharp jawline clenched. "You were hired to reconcile the accounts of the Northern Estates, not to launch an inquisition into my personal staff. I was hired to find out why one of the wealthiest dukedoms in England is facing insolvency within the decade," Genevieve replied, her tone as cool and clear as river water. She opened the ledger. "The numbers do not lie, Your Grace. Men do. Your steward, Mr. Arbuthnot, has been systematically embezzling from the estate for the better part of 6 years." Nolan's eyes flashed. "Arbuthnot has served my family since I was a boy. He was my late father's confidant. Loyalty is an admirable trait, but it is remarkably easy to feign when one is siphoning £5,000 a quarter into a private account at Coutts & Co., Genevieve stated, pushing a stack of heavily annotated banking documents across the polished desk. "Look at the invoices for the coal shipments out of Cardiff. He has been claiming a 20% loss to spoilage and transit damage. Coal, Your Grace, does not spoil. It is being redirected and sold on the black market. Furthermore, the expenditures for this very London house are inflated by nearly 40%. Nolan approached the desk, not to look at the papers, but to tower over her. He was a man of the old world, a world where an aristocrat's word was law, and the mere suggestion of internal rot was a direct insult to his competence. He felt a sudden, irrational spike of fury not at Arbuthnot, whose guilt he was too proud to immediately accept, but at the woman sitting before him. She was entirely unbothered by his wealth, his title, or his temper. Her calm, assessing gaze made him feel stripped bare, exposed as a fool who couldn't govern his own house. "I will not have a contracted clerk march into my study and accuse a loyal servant of thievery based on a few mismatched ciphers," Nolan snapped. "They are not mismatched ciphers. They are a meticulously constructed web of fraud," Genevieve insisted, finally standing up. Despite her modest height, the sheer force of her conviction allowed her to hold her ground against him. "If you do not dismiss him and freeze the estate's liquid assets by Friday, you will lose the controlling shares in the Great Western Railway. If you lose the railway, Lord Cornwall will initiate a hostile takeover of your remaining shipping lines. You will be ruined." The mention of Lord Cornwall, his bitterest rival in both society and commerce, was the match that lit the powder keg. Nolan's pride, already bruised, shattered into raw, aristocratic arrogance. He slammed his hand against the desk, the sound cracking like a gunshot through the silent library. "Enough!" he roared. He snatched the ledger from the desk and threw it to the floor. The heavy book hit the Persian rug with a dull, heavy thud, the carefully written pages crumpling. "I am the Duke of Rothshire. I do not take orders from a common auditor. I brought you here as a courtesy to my bankers, but I see now it was a profound mistake." Genevieve looked at the ruined ledger on the floor and then slowly raised her eyes to meet his. The fire in her chest was entirely concealed by the ice in her demeanor. She had spent her entire life fighting to be respected in rooms full of powerful, arrogant men. She knew when a battle was lost. More importantly, she knew when to let a man engineer his own destruction. "You are arrogant, Your Grace," Genevieve said quietly, "and arrogance is the most expensive luxury a man in your position can possess. I can hire 50 like you." The Duke sneered, his chest heaving as he pointed toward the heavy oak doors of the study. 50 clerks who will do exactly as they are told, without weaving hysterical fantasies of betrayal. Genevieve didn't flinch. She reached for her dark wool coat draped over the back of the chair and calmly slipped it on. She picked up her leather satchel, leaving the crumpled ledger on the floor. "Do it," she replied, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She turned on her heel and walked out of the library, her footsteps echoing sharply down the marble corridor. Nolan stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily, entirely convinced he had just excised a nuisance from his life. He watched the rain begin to lash against the arched windows, feeling a hollow sense of victory. But as the days turned into weeks, he would soon discover that Genevieve Hastings was not a nuisance. She was the only structural pillar holding his crumbling empire together, and he had just knocked her down. 6 weeks later, the Duke of Rothshire's world was on fire. The 50 clerks Nolan had so confidently boasted about turned out to be 5 senior accountants dispatched from Price Waterhouse at exorbitant fees. They sat in the very same library where Genevieve had been dismissed, drowning in a sea of paper, sweating profusely under the Duke's deepening glare. "What do you mean you cannot reconcile the northern accounts?" Nolan demanded, his voice devoid of its usual booming authority, replaced now by a sharp, frayed edge. He had not slept a full night in a fortnight. The senior accountant, a trembling man named Mr. Higgins, adjusted his spectacles. "Your Grace, the previous auditor, Miss Hastings." She utilized a proprietary double-entry cipher for the most sensitive expenditures. It is a system of her own invention. Without her master key, the ledgers from the Cardiff mines look like absolute gibberish. "We cannot trace the missing funds." Nolan closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. It was exactly as she had warned. 3 weeks after Genevieve walked out, Mr. Arbuthnot had vanished. The steward hadn't just fled. He had absconded to France with nearly £80,000 in liquid capital, leaving behind a mountain of forged debts. The Great Western Railway shares were now plummeting, and Lord Cornwell, smelling blood in the water, was quietly buying up Rothshire debts through proxy firms. Nolan was standing on the precipice of a total financial collapse. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Genevieve had been right about everything. Her brilliance hadn't been a threat to his authority. It had been his salvation, and his blind, suffocating pride had driven her away. "Find her," Nolan ordered, opening his eyes. "Sir?" Higgins stammered. "Find Miss Hastings. Go to Baring Brothers. Offer them whatever commission they require. Double her previous fee. Triple it. I don't care. Just get her back in this room." But getting Genevieve Hastings back proved to be a task entirely beyond Nolan's vast resources. Baring Brothers politely informed the Duke's solicitors that Miss Hastings was no longer in their employ. She had resigned her position the very morning after her confrontation at Grosvenor House. She had left no forwarding address, no letter of intent. The finest private investigators in London, men who had tracked runaway heiresses across continents, came up empty-handed. She had evaporated into the London fog. Nolan's desperation morphed into an obsession. He began to see her in crowds, the tilt of a dark hat, the determined stride of a woman crossing a street in Mayfair, only to realize it was a stranger. He hated that she had bested him, but deeper down, he was plagued by a profound, agonizing guilt. The echo of her final, defiant, "do it" haunted his empty, echoing halls. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when a breakthrough finally arrived, entirely by accident. Nolan, seeking a distraction from his impending ruin, had accepted an invitation to dine at the Savoy Hotel. The newly opened establishment was a marvel of the modern age, blazing with the brilliant, harsh light of electricity. The dining room was a sea of silk, diamonds, and the quiet murmur of London's elite cutting their teeth on new money. Nolan was nursing a glass of scotch at his corner table when he saw her. She wasn't wearing the severe dark wool of a bank's clerk. She was draped in a stunning gown of deep emerald velvet, her dark hair swept up in an elegant, modern style. She looked radiant, powerful, and entirely out of his reach. But it wasn't her transformation that made the blood freeze in Nolan's veins. It was the man she was dining with. Sitting across from Genevieve Hastings, laughing warmly at something she had just said, was Lord Cornwell. Nolan didn't think. The aristocratic composure he had spent a lifetime perfecting shattered. He crossed the dining room in long, predatory strides, ignoring the startled glances of the surrounding patrons. He stopped directly at their table. Cornwell looked up,
Do it!
a smug, aristocratic smile spreading across his face. "Rothshire, what a pleasant surprise. Have you come to beg for a loan?" Nolan ignored him entirely. His eyes were locked on Genevieve. She looked up at him, her expression pleasant, composed, and utterly unbothered. The ice was still there, but it was polished now. "Miss Hastings," Nolan said, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. "Your Grace," Genevieve replied smoothly, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. "I see you survived the quarter. Barely. I need to speak with you. Now. In private." Cornwell bristled. "See here, Rothshire, you cannot interrupt my dinner guest." "I am not speaking to you, Cornwell," Nolan snapped, keeping his eyes on Genevieve. "Please, Genevieve, 5 minutes." It was the first time he had ever used her Christian name. The slip was a glaring admission of his desperation. Genevieve studied his face, the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his jaw, the arrogant Duke brought entirely to heel in the middle of London's most public arena. She turned to Cornwell. "Excuse me for a moment, my lord." Genevieve rose and walked toward the opulent, deserted foyer of the hotel. Nolan followed closely behind, his heart hammering against his ribs. When they reached the quiet alcove beneath a grand chandelier, she turned to face him, crossing her arms. "You look terrible, Your Grace," she observed mildly. "Arbuthnot fled," Nolan said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "He took 80,000. The ledgers are locked in your cipher, and Cornwell is buying my debts. You knew this would happen." "I told you it would happen," she corrected him. "You chose to protect your pride over your legacy." "I was wrong." The admission physically hurt him, but he forced the words out. Quote, "I was a fool. I am asking you, I am begging you to come back." Unquote. "Name your price. I will pay it." Unquote. 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 Genevieve offered a slow, sharp smile that sent a shiver down Nolan's spine. It wasn't a smile of a clerk. It was the smile of a predator who had successfully laid a trap. "You misunderstand the situation, Nolan," she said softly, stepping closer. "I am not an employee anymore. I resigned from Baring Brothers the morning after you threw my ledger on the floor. I took my life savings and started my own acquisitions firm. Lord Cornwell isn't employing me." She leaned in, the scent of jasmine and cold rain wrapping around him. "Lord Cornwell is my client. I am the one buying your debts, Your Grace, and I am not coming back to work for you. If you want to survive this, we are going to be partners. 50-50. And you will never, ever raise your voice to me again. Nolan stared at her, the reality of her words crashing over him. The woman he had dismissed as a common calculator hadn't just walked away. She had walked out, bought the chessboard, and cornered his king. And heaven help him. As he looked into her blazing, brilliant eyes, he had never been more captivated by a woman in his entire life. The silence in the Savoy's gilded foyer was absolute, save for the distant, muffled waltz drifting from the ballroom. Nolan Montgomery, a man whose ancestors had stared down kings, found himself entirely speechless before a 24-year-old mathematician in an emerald gown. 50-50, Nolan finally repeated, the words rolling off his tongue as if he were tasting a foreign language. You are proposing a hostile reorganization of my own dukedom. You want half of everything. I want half of the holding company I will establish to manage your assets, Genevieve corrected, her voice perfectly even. The title, the ancestral homes, the lands those remain yours, your grace. But the shipping lines, the Welsh coal rights, the Great Western Railway shares, those will be managed by Hastings and partners. I will hold 50% of the voting rights. You cannot sell, liquidate, or mismanage a single lump of coal without my express written consent. And if I refuse, then Lord Cornwell acquires your debts by Friday, Genevieve replied, gesturing faintly toward the dining room. He strips your assets, sells the shipping fleet to the Americans, likely J.S. Morgan & Co., and you spend the rest of your life as a very well-dressed pauper, living on the charity of distant cousins. Nolan's jaw tightened. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes, the iron will masked by her delicate features. She was not bluffing. She had outmaneuvered him, and more impressively, she had outmaneuvered Lord Cornwell, who sat 100 feet away, blissfully unaware that the woman he thought was his proxy was actually carving up the prize for herself. You used Cornwell's own capital to buy up my debts, Nolan deduced, a slow, disbelieving laugh escaping his lips. You are acting as his broker, but the contracts are in your firm's name. A technicality of maritime and holding law, Genevieve said, with a modest shrug. One that Lord Cornwell's solicitors failed to notice when I drafted the agreements. He believes he is employing me as a private asset liquidator. He is quite patronizing, actually. It makes him terribly easy to manipulate. Nolan felt a sudden, fierce spark of admiration. It was entirely inappropriate, given the circumstances, but he couldn't help it. He extended his hand. 50-50, Miss Hastings. You have a deal. Genevieve looked at his hand for a long moment before taking it. Her grip was firm, her skin cool against his. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. My office is on Lombard Street. Do not be late, Nolan. The use of his given name sent a strange jolt through his chest. She released his hand and walked back into the dining room, leaving the Duke of Rothshire standing alone under the chandelier, his empire essentially sold, yet feeling more alive than he had in years. The next morning, Nolan arrived at Lombard Street 10 minutes early. Hastings and Partners was a discreet operation, tucked above a prominent haberdashery. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to his own chaotic library. Clerks moved with quiet efficiency. Genevieve was waiting for him in an office overlooking the street. She was back in her severe, tailored business attire, her hair pinned tightly. Spread across her mahogany desk were the very ledgers he had thrown on his library floor. "Sit," she instructed. Nolan sat. "So, partner, how do we stop Cornwell?" "We don't," Genevieve said, handing him a freshly inked document. "We let him think he's winning. I have delayed the final transfer of your debts for 3 weeks. In the time, we must recover the £80,000 Arbuthnot stole. If we inject that cash directly into the Great Western Railway shares, it will trigger a defensive clause in the railway's charter, blocking Cornwell's hostile takeover. The holding company will stabilize, and Cornwell's leveraged debts will become toxic. He will lose a fortune." A brilliant theory, Nolan conceded. But Arbuthnot has vanished. My investigators found nothing. Your investigators are looking for a thief, Genevieve said, unlocking a drawer and pulling out a leather-bound journal. I am looking for the money. My cipher wasn't just to hide the numbers. It was a tracking mechanism. I noticed a recurring numerical anomaly in the forged invoices. A routing number. Arbuthnot wasn't just hoarding gold under a mattress. He was wiring the funds through a shell corporation to the Crédit Lyonnais in Paris. Nolan leaned forward, his blood running hot. You know exactly where he is. I know where the money is, she corrected. And a man like Arbuthnot will never be far from his stolen fortune. We leave for Paris tonight. Paris, in the summer of 1889, was a city intoxicated by its own grandeur. The Exposition Universelle was in full swing, and the newly erected Eiffel Tower pierced the smog-filled sky like a needle of iron and ambition. Nolan and Genevieve occupied a private compartment on the boat train to the Gare du Nord. The journey had been a study in strained proximity. For 2 days, they had pored over legal documents and banking charters, their knees occasionally brushing in the narrow carriage, the scent of her jasmine perfume driving Nolan slowly out of his mind. He had spent his life surrounded by society beauties who agreed with his every word and sought only to secure his title. Genevieve argued with him. She challenged him. She looked at his sprawling wealth and saw only an equation waiting to be solved. And yet, beneath the ice, he had caught glimpses of a deep, burning passion, not for money, but for order, for justice, for proving her worth in a world designed to ignore her. You never asked for an apology, Nolan said quietly, breaking a long silence as the French countryside rolled past their window. Genevieve looked up from her paperwork. An apology for what? For my behavior, the day I dismissed you. I was arrogant, blind, and cruel. I treated you like a servant when you were trying to save my life. Genevieve set her pen down. She looked at the rain lashing against the glass, her expression softening just a fraction. I have been patronized by men of wealth since I was 14 years old, Nolan. If I demanded an apology from every man who underestimated me, I would have no time left to work. I did not want your apology. I wanted you to realize you were wrong. I was wrong, he said, holding her gaze, the intensity in his dark eyes stripping the air from the small compartment. About everything. A heavy, charged silence fell between them, thick with words unsaid. Genevieve swallowed hard, forcing her eyes back to the documents. We will need to visit the Crédit Lyonnais the moment we arrive. I have a contact there, Monsieur Dupont, a senior underwriter. He owes Baring Brothers a favor. The following afternoon, Paris was a blur of carriages and chaotic crowds. Monsieur Dupont, a nervous man with a waxed mustache, had proven incredibly useful. Under the threat of Genevieve exposing a minor yet scandalous accounting error he had made years prior, Dupont handed over the private ledger of the Shell Corporation. The funds were indeed there, entirely liquid, stored in bearer bonds. The account was held under the name L.A. Holdings. Lucius Arbuthnot, Nolan growled as they stood on the steps of the Grand Bank. Where is the account holder staying, Dupont? A private residence in Montmartre. Your Grace, the banker stammered, handing over a slip of paper. He withdrew 10,000 francs only yesterday. By nightfall, Nolan and Genevieve stood in the shadows of a narrow cobblestone alleyway in Montmartre. Rain slicked the streets, reflecting the gaslight in pooling puddles. The residence was a modest but heavily guarded townhouse. 2 large, unsavory-looking men stood by the iron gate, smoking cigarettes. We go to the local gendarmerie, Genevieve whispered, her breath misting in the cold air. We have the proof. They can arrest him. If we involve the French police, the funds will be impounded as evidence for months, Nolan replied grimly. We don't have months. We have until Friday. We need those bearer bonds tonight. Before Genevieve could protest, Nolan unbuttoned his heavy overcoat. He wasn't just a titled lord. He had spent his youth boxing at Oxford, and his anger had been simmering for weeks. "Wait here," he instructed. "Nolan, no!" He didn't listen. He stepped out of the shadows, walking casually toward the gates. One of the guards stepped forward, barking something in rough French. Nolan didn't bother translating. He delivered a brutal, perfectly calculated right hook to the man's jaw. The guard crumpled instantly. The second man lunged, drawing a heavy wooden truncheon. Genevieve gasped, pressing herself against the damp brick wall. Nolan dodged the swing, grabbed the man's coat collar, and drove his knee upward into his chest. The fight was over in less than 30 seconds. Nolan straightened his cuffs, breathing heavily, and turned to Genevieve.
I can hire
"The path
50
is
like
clear,
you.
Miss Hastings." Genevieve hurried forward,
Duke
her
said,
heart
"Do it!"
hammering wildly. "You are entirely barbaric," she hissed, though her eyes betrayed a glimmer of awe. "I am motivated," he corrected, kicking the iron gate open. They slipped into the townhouse, the front door unlocked. The interior smelled of stale wine and expensive cigars. They moved silently toward the flickering light of a study at the end of the hall. Inside, sitting by a roaring fire with a glass of cognac, was Lucius Arbuthnot. He looked older, tired, and entirely terrified when the door swung open to reveal the towering Duke of Rothshire. "Your Grace!" Arbuthnot gasped, dropping his glass. It shattered on the hearth. Nolan crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing the steward by the lapels of his velvet smoking jacket and hauling him out of his chair. "The bearer bonds, Lucius. Where are they?" "I don't." Nolan slammed him back against the oak-paneled wall. "Do not lie to me. You stole my family's legacy. You betrayed my father's memory. Where are the bonds?"
It wasn't my idea.
Arbuthnot cried, tears welling in his rheumy eyes.
I swear it to you, Nolan. I was in debt. Gambling debts. He found out. He forced me to do it.
"Who?" Genevieve stepped fully into the room, her eyes darting around the study until they landed on a heavy iron safe tucked behind the desk. "Who forced you?" "Cornwell," Arbuthnot sobbed. "Lord Cornwell. He paid off my gambling markers. He told me to siphon the funds, to make the estate bleed. He wanted you weak so he could buy you out for pennies. The bonds are his." Nolan froze, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal washing over him. Cornwell hadn't just capitalized on his misfortune. He had engineered it from the very beginning. The rage that spiked in Nolan's chest was lethal. He raised his fist. "Nolan, stop!" Genevieve's voice cut through his fury like a blade. She walked over to the desk, completely ignoring the trembling steward. "The safe, Mr. Arbuthnot. Open it. Now." Arbuthnot, shaking violently, scrambled to the safe. He spun the dial, the heavy lock clicking into place. Genevieve pulled the heavy door open and reached inside, pulling out a thick stack of embossed bearer bonds. 80,000 pounds. The salvation of Rothshire. "We have what we came for," Genevieve said, turning to Nolan. "Let him go. He is a pathetic pawn. We have a king to checkmate." Nolan released Arbuthnot, who slid to the floor in a weeping heap. He looked at Genevieve, clutching the bonds to her chest. In the firelight, flushed with adrenaline and triumph, she was magnificent. They walked out of the townhouse and into the pouring Paris rain, neither speaking until they reached the safety of their hotel suite. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, the adrenaline finally broke. Genevieve dropped the bonds onto the console table. She was trembling slightly, whether from the cold or the danger, she didn't know. "You could have been killed," she whispered, turning to face him. Nolan crossed the room. He didn't stop until he was mere inches from her. "I have been dead for 6 weeks, Genevieve, ever since you walked out of my library." He reached out, his large hands gently framing her face. She didn't pull away. The ice in her eyes had completely melted, replaced by a fierce, undeniable heat. "We are partners," she breathed, her hands resting flat against his damp chest. Strictly business. To hell with business, Nolan murmured. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a polite, aristocratic kiss. It was desperate, hungry, and fueled by weeks of suppressed desire. Genevieve gasped against his mouth, her hands gripping the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer as the Paris rain battered the windows, washing away the remnants of the Duke's pride, leaving only the man beneath. The journey back to London was a blur of steam, iron, and a profound electric shift in the atmosphere between them. The bearer bonds were secured in Genevieve's leather satchel, a silent testament to their unorthodox victory. But it was the lingering heat of their embrace in Paris that occupied the silence of the train carriage. The aristocratic barrier between the Duke and the mathematician had not just been breached, it had been entirely demolished. They arrived at Victoria Station late Thursday evening, the London fog thick and choking. There was no time for rest. Friday morning was the deadline. At 9 o'clock, Lord Cornwell was scheduled to arrive at the Lombard Street offices of Hastings and Partners to finalize the hostile acquisition of the Rothshire debts. By 8:30 the next morning, Nolan stood in the corner of Genevieve's office, watching her work. She was a maestro, conducting a symphony of destruction. She dispatched clerks to NM, Rothschild and Sons, to deposit the recovered bonds directly into the Great Western Railway holding accounts, while simultaneously drafting a series of injunctions with the ruthless efficiency of a seasoned general. "You look entirely too calm," Nolan observed, leaning against the mahogany wainscoting. He was dressed impeccably in a dark morning coat, the picture of aristocratic composure, though his blood was singing with anticipation. "Panic is a byproduct of being unprepared, Nolan," Genevieve murmured, signing her name to the bottom of a heavy parchment document with a flourish. She capped her fountain pen and looked up at him, a dangerous sparkle in her dark eyes. "And I have been preparing for Lord Cornwell since the day I realized he was manipulating your estate." At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the outer office swung open. Lord Cornwell strode in, accompanied by two severe-looking solicitors. He wore the smug, impenetrable expression of a man who believed he had just conquered a kingdom. Genevieve remained seated behind her desk, her posture perfectly straight. Lord Cornwell, punctual, as always. "Miss Hastings," Cornwell greeted, stepping into the office and taking a seat without being offered one. He unbuttoned his coat, leaning back. "I trust the final deeds of transfer are ready. I have a luncheon at the Carlton Club, and I would like to celebrate the acquisition of the Rothshire shipping fleet before my soup gets cold." "The documents are fully prepared," Genevieve said smoothly, resting her hands on the polished wood. Cornwell chuckled, tapping his gold-tipped cane against the floor. "Excellent. You know, Miss Hastings, you have proven to be quite the useful instrument. When Edward Baring himself recommended your peculiar talents, I was skeptical. A woman handling matters of high finance? But you have navigated Rothshire's utter incompetence brilliantly. I will ensure you receive a handsome bonus." "I am afraid that will not be necessary, Cornwell." A deep, resonant voice echoed from the shadows of the room. Cornwell froze. He turned his head sharply as Nolan stepped forward into the gaslight, his expression carved from stone. "Rothshire," Cornwell barked, standing up, his face flushing with a mix of confusion and indignation. "What in the devil are you doing here?" "This is a private meeting between myself and my brokers." "She is not your broker," Nolan replied, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "And you are not buying my fleet. You are not buying my railway shares. In fact, by the time the stock exchange rings the afternoon bell, you will be scrambling to save your own ancestral home." Cornwell sneered, recovering his bravado. "A pathetic bluff. Your steward gutted your liquid assets. You have defaulted on your quarterly obligations to Barclays. The debts belong to me, and the holding company defaults at noon." Genevieve finally stood up. She picked up a single sheet of paper from her desk and walked around to hand it directly to Cornwell's lead solicitor. Lord Cornwell is operating under outdated intelligence, Genevieve stated clearly. At 8:45 this morning, £80,000 in bearer bonds were deposited into the Rothschild primary accounts at N.M. Rothschild and Sons.
hire 50
This
like
capital
you.
injection triggered the defensive charter of the Great Western Railway,
The Duke
immediately
said, "Do it!"
neutralizing any hostile takeover bids. Cornwell's face went entirely pale. 80,000? That's impossible. Arbuthnot. He stopped short, realizing his fatal error. Nolan stepped closer, towering over the older aristocrat. Arbuthnot was very talkative in Paris. Cornwell. He confessed to the blackmail. He confessed to the forgery. We have his sworn statement, witnessed by a senior underwriter at the Credit Lyonnais. We recovered the stolen funds you forced him to hide. You went to Paris? Cornwell stammered, looking wildly between the Duke and Genevieve. The smugness had evaporated, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. Furthermore, Genevieve continued, her voice as sharp as cut glass, because you heavily leveraged your own estates through Barclays to purchase the Rothschild debts on margin, assuming you would immediately recoup the cost by liquidating the shipping fleet to J.S. Morgan & Co., you are now holding a massive toxic debt. The Rothschild assets are no longer available for liquidation. You owe Barclays nearly £200,000 by the end of the month, with absolutely no collateral to cover it. The solicitor reading the document dropped it onto the desk as if it were on fire. My lord, the man whispered to Cornwell, his voice trembling. She is right. You are entirely over-leveraged. It is financial ruin. Cornwell stared at Genevieve, his chest heaving, his aristocratic entitlement shattering into a million irreparable pieces. You orchestrated this, he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at her. You let me buy the debts! You led me to the slaughter! I simply allowed you to dig your own grave, Lord Cornwell, Genevieve replied coldly. I merely handed you the shovel. Now, I suggest you leave my offices before the Duke decides to settle the matter of your blackmail with his fists. I assure you, having seen his right hook, you would not survive the encounter. Cornwell looked at Nolan's clenched jaw and broad shoulders, then back to the icy brilliance of the woman who had just dismantled his life's work. Without another word, he turned and fled the office, his solicitors practically running to keep up with him. Silence descended upon the room once more, broken only by the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages on Lombard Street. Nolan let out a long, slow breath. He looked at the closed door, and then turned to Genevieve. She was standing by the window, the morning light catching the triumphant flush in her cheeks. He walked over to her, closing the distance between them until there was nowhere else in the world he would rather be. 50-50, Nolan said softly, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. You played your part adequately, Your Grace, she teased, though her breathing had hitched at his touch. I told you once that I could hire 50 clerks like you, Nolan murmured, his hands moving to rest on her waist, pulling her flush against him. It was the greatest lie I have ever told. There is no one in this world like you, Genevieve, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, in the boardroom and out of it. Genevieve looked up into his eyes, the final remnants of her guarded ice melting into a fierce, blazing fire. She reached up, her hands sliding around the lapels of his coat. Then you had best get to work, Nolan, she whispered, because I am a very demanding partner. He smiled, a true, brilliant smile that erased the shadows of his pride and captured her lips with his own. The Duke of Rothschild had lost half his empire to a mathematician, but as he held her in the heart of London, he knew with absolute certainty that he had won the world. If you were captivated by Genevieve's brilliant mind and Nolan's redemption, don't keep this story to yourself. Hit that like button to support our channel. Share this video with fellow lovers of historical drama and slow-burn romance, and absolutely subscribe for more thrilling, original tales. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a twist. What should our next story be about? Tell us in the comments.